With a major selection of the looks your kiddos love starting at just $4 in the Walmart app, a new school year means a stylish new them. Who knew? Find skater skirts and Crocs that say, I'm casual but cool. Sparkly sneakers that say, it's my classroom, you're just learning in it. And preppy polos that say, I'm the teacher's pet, even if they're mommy's menace at home. Find their favorite styles starting at just $4 in the app. The Walmart you thought you knew is now new.
How do you top your love for your cat? With a cascade of decadent savory gravy over a mouth-watering mousse pâté. Fancy Feast gems. 2 gourmet pâtés in one convenient pack. Simply peel and plate to reveal a pyramid shape that makes eating delightful and pamper her with an experience as extraordinary as she is. Turn the everyday into the extraordinary with Fancy Feast gems.
This episode is sponsored by Friskies, who would like to tell your cats hi. Now, if that didn't get your cat's attention, there's one thing that always does the trick. Just pour some Friskies crunchy food in the bowl and you'll hear those paws come running. Works every time. With so many Friskies choices, you can always bring your cats running from their secret napping spots. There's always more to explore. See for yourself at friskies.com or visit your local store.
Welcome to the New Books Network.
I'm Chris Holmes, and this is Burned by Books. Here you'll find interviews with writers you already love, like Jennifer Egan and Rebecca Mackay, mixed in with up-and-coming voices like Alexandra Kleeman and Rumaan Alam. You'll find us wherever you listen to podcasts, but check out previous episodes at burnedbybooks.com and on Instagram and Twitter at burnedbybooks. Let's start the show. In Megan Cummins' debut novel of adolescent vulnerability, Atomic Hearts, her protagonist, Gertie, is in possession of a secret that will crack open her world if revealed. She already exists in an eggshell household, with her father out of the house after a stint in rehab, and her mother pursuing stability in an ugly match with a new partner. That secret will send her from Michigan to Sioux Falls to escape the inevitable. But as teenagerdom is a suitcase of trauma that travels with you, she will soon find a new group of friends with their own secrets and flaws. Moving back and forth in time between Gertie's years at home and her adult life taking care of an aging mother, Atomic Hearts splays open the vibrancy, insecurity, and preternatural wisdom of a teenager's interior life in a prose that is raw and immediate. A novel about the weight of guilt and the necessity of forgiveness shows how both can disappoint. Gertie is an unforgettable new voice in American fiction, both recognizable and wholly original. She is the best friend we wish we had when we needed a Gertie the most. Megan Cummins is the author of If the Body Allows It, awarded the 2019 Prairie Schooner Book Prize and longlisted for the Story Prize and the Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize for debut short story collection. Her stories and essays have appeared in A Public Space, Guernica, One Teen Story, Ninth Letter, Electric Literature, and elsewhere. She edits Public Books, a magazine of arts, ideas, and scholarship. Welcome to Burned by Books, Megan Cummins.
Thank you for having me, Chris. What a lovely introduction to Atomic Hearts.
Well, I'm so glad that I got to read this book and really just fall in love with Gertie as a protagonist and as a voice that I just really wanted to keep going in my head. I was really sad when I had to say goodbye to her. And I wanted to start out by asking you where Gertie came from and how that voice came to you and whether it was you started with the voice or whether it came along as the story progressed.
Yeah, so that's such a good question. And sorry, I will try not to start every answer with that's such a good question because I didn't need to do that. But so Atomic Hearts actually started as a short story that was published in If the Body Allows It. And prior to that was published in One Teen Story. And so that is the very beginning of Gertie. Back then her name was Erica, actually, and I decided it wasn't right for her. And it was interesting to look back on the story called Aerosol. And as I decided I wanted to turn it into a novel, I realized that the character in Aerosol didn't quite have the vulnerability that I wanted to see in the novel. And so Gertie transformed a little bit from there. And I have often thought of the question of where her voice came from. And I find it a little difficult to answer because she's been with me for almost 10 years at this point. And she's certainly changed over that time as I have. And I think, though, that I started with just the idea of a teenager at a time in her life who's forced with having to change her life before she's figured out who she is in the first place. And I wondered how I could show that immediacy of change and vulnerability
Hmm.
and a little bit of chaos too on the page. And it became very important to me to write the story or to write the novel in first person. I felt I wouldn't be able to I felt I wouldn't be able to get close enough to Gertie any other way. And I often feel like first person when you, in at least my experience in this novel working with first person, it's such a slow accumulation of experience and intimacy with the character that the complexity often, for me, becomes so ingrained in my thinking of it that I have a hard time sort of tracing the origins back to the beginning.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you mentioned wanting Erica to become more vulnerable as Megan. I mean, not as Megan, as Gertie. There's a Freudian slip there. But, Gertie's vulnerability is really one of my favorite things about her. And she's vulnerable even when it's not really in her best interest to be vulnerable. And I wondered if you thought about like what it means to kind of like allow vulnerability into your life at a time when most of us, I think, in our teenage adolescent years feel like under attack.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny that you said Megan rather, when Erica became Megan rather than Gertie. I mean, autofiction is certainly something I thought a lot about while writing this book. There are certainly shades of Gertie in myself, which is probably something I should have said in my last answer. The book is, in some ways, I think its subject is autofiction more so than it being autofiction itself. There are certainly parts of it that I've drawn from my real experiences, but I became more interested in writing about autofiction than writing autofiction itself.
Hmm.
So just that is just maybe an addendum to my last answer, but
Yeah, yeah.
the idea of vulnerability in your teenage years, I think is so complicated because it's a time when we're all vulnerable. It's a time when we're all vulnerable, but at the same time, maybe the time when you're most resistant to showing it. And I think I saw that in Gertie as I was writing her. There are people she allows herself to be vulnerable. There are people she allows herself to be vulnerable around, but for others, she really closes herself off. And I think that's such a balance at that time in your life when you're finding out who you can trust. And even sometimes the people you think you can trust the most or know you can trust the most with your mistakes and with your deepest fears and feelings, suddenly maybe you're not so sure anymore. And that tumult is so shaping for Gertie. And it really changes day to day too with her. Every day in the summer of her life presents something new to keep secret. And she has to decide whether or not to keep it a secret.
So the novel moves back and forth in Gertie's timeline from her past, when she leaves Michigan for Sioux Falls to live with her father, to the present, and when she's caring for her mother and living with her partner. Is it Kieran?
Huron, yeah.
Kieran. Kieran. It's one of those Irish names that
Yes, yeah.
I just feel like the Roman alphabet fails Irish just so devastatingly.
It really does, yes.
It's not Irish is the Irish language's fault. It's the failure of the
Yeah.
alphabet to do it justice. So Kieran. But what did this chronological vacillation produce for you in the writing? And how do you think it changes our sense of Gertie and her relationship to her parents?
The chronological vacillation is something that was actually added to the book rather late. For a long time,
Really, that's fascinating because
yeah.
it's so central to the reader's experience of
It
it.
is, and it changed everything once I added that. For a long time, the book was only Gertie's story as a teenager that summer, and a much bigger portion of the book in early drafts was actually the novel that Gertie writes as a teenager, the fantasy novel. And as I was working on what became the final revision before my agent sent it out was the idea of paring back the fantasy novel and adding Gertie as an adult because I felt the book was missing a layer. I think there was a time when I felt the novel could be a YA novel, but I felt it had adult themes and sensibilities. And so it wasn't working as a YA novel, but it also wasn't working as an adult novel. In part, I think just because teenage protagonists can be a hard sell in the adult market, but even thinking outside of the market, I felt there was a crucial perspective that we didn't have. And so I started with actually a very thin layer. There was a very thin gloss of adult Gertie. And my agent actually sent out that version. And the editor I ended up going with, the editor who bought my book, the wonderful Jesse Schumann at Ballentine, he immediately said before the offer was made, when we had our first meeting, he asked if expanding that adult timeline it's something I'd be interested in. And I said, absolutely. Because I think already after my agent sent it out, I was sort of like, wait, bring it back. So, I want to add more. And timing was really good. I ended up going not long after that. I went to Hawthornden for a month. I did a residency at at Hawthornden Castle in Scotland. And it was a really
That
intense.
sounds like a real hardship.
Oh, I know. It was really, really difficult. Just they did my laundry and they cooked all the meals. But
Oh my God.
so I was there.
I'm going to end the interview.
I know. It's just she's insufferable. But during the time at Hawthornden, I had never been to a residency before. It was my very first residency. And it was such a wonderful experience. I wrote the entire adult frame as it is now in the novel. There was a little bit of work after that, but I spent the month writing that out and expanding that. And I think I'm really grateful I had that month of intense concentration to be able to do that, or else it would have taken me a long, long time to be able to flesh it out in a way that felt organic. But because I was working on it every day, all day, and doing nothing else, I was able to get into a state with my writing that I maybe never have before. I don't even know that I can call it flow state, but I was very, very immersed. And so that is practically the origin of the adult timeline. But it became clear as soon as I started writing it that we needed to know, or maybe I needed to know, that Gertie was okay.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not perfect. No one's life is perfect. There are still struggles in the adult timeline, but it was important for me to provide a sense to the reader that she does make it out of this summer, even when things are at their worst.
Yeah, because there's definitely an alternate timeline where she doesn't, because things go really badly and things kind of tilt out of her control, and you could see that it might not have ended up okay. I imagined her alive, but perhaps not in good shape. And part of, I think, what makes her able to solidify her okayness is partially Kieran, but it's also her relationship with her mother. And you do a wonderful job of showing the ways in which young children, especially, are too often asked to mediate relationships between adults. And sometimes that's after a divorce, whether it's with an ex or a new partner. And that's, what we get with that change in chronology is we see Gertie being asked too much by her parents, and then in a position as an adult to take the adults on differently in their context as full and flawed people. I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about that relationship between young children or adolescents and their parents, and then Gertie as an adult and her mom.
I think Gertie, as a teenager, absolutely hasn't realized all the ways in which her parents are fully their own individuals. They exist to her in a way as her parents. And I think Gertie, maybe more than some teenagers, can see nuances in who they are and can see a little bit beyond the idea that they're just her parents. But still, as with, I think, most teenagers, it's hard when you're that age to really understand the full lives your parents have lived
Hmm.
and the fact that they were alive for a long time before you existed.
Yeah.
And as a teenager, Gertie, in some ways, accepts the mantle of being able to save her father. She thinks her mother couldn't, but if she just sticks it out in Sioux Falls with him, maybe she can. With her mother, I think often teenage girls have a difficult relationship to their mothers. Of course, not always, but some do, in ways that is not always entirely fair to the mother. There's a moment in the book where Gertie's mom in the adult timeline says, "I think you were a little too easy on your dad and a little too hard on me," which I think is probably absolutely true in Gertie's writing. But seeing her mom later on in the adult timeline, I think Gertie is learning to accept her mother's, or in the later timeline, Gertie is learning how to see the why of what her mother did as
Mhm.
when Gertie was a teenager. And it might not necessarily have been the best decisions, but there was a why to it. Her mother does love her, and Gertie does love her mother. And that is another reason why I think the adult timeline was so crucial for the final version of the book, because her mother is pretty absent during the summer Gertie's a teenager. And I knew I needed to make the mother into a fully fleshed out character in a way that wasn't possible in the teenage timeline. And so much of the adult timeline, well, it's certainly about Gertie reflecting the summer she spent with her father. It's also about a redemption of her relationship with her mother in all of its complexities and it's in all of its messiness, but in learning to live together in the world.
Hey, it's Paris. You know, I love sparkly things, right? Like stars. Duh. And thanks to Hilton and AutoCamp, I just slept under them. Picture me, serving looks by the fire outside my luxurious Airstream, making s'mores with the kids, while a national park is our backdrop. The great outdoors meets Hilton hospitality. That's hot. Explore all the new ways to stay at Hilton.com. Hilton for the stay.
Brace the rudders! Raise the sails! Raise the sails!
Captain, an unidentified ship is approaching. Over.
Roger. Wait, is that an enterprise sales solution?
Reach sales professionals, not professional sailors. With LinkedIn ads, you can target the right people by industry, job title, and more. We'll even give you a $100 credit on your next campaign. Get started today at linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply.
That's nicely said. So as profound as those relationships are for Gertie with her parents, she has this incredible teen friendship with Cindy, and their bond is forged over both of their fathers' struggles with addiction. And there is power in this shared trauma, but there's also a great deal of risk for both of them. And I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about the sort of double-edged sword of this kind of bond over a shared trauma of a parent who can't fully be there for them because they're struggling with their own traumatic, in this case, use of drugs and alcohol.
Oh, absolutely. Gertie and Cindy have been friends forever, and their fathers were friends even before they were born. And part of their father's friendship was built both in childhood, but then later on through struggles with addiction. And Gertie and Cindy at that age, I think, they must be so, in a way, relieved to find someone they can talk openly about or that they can talk openly with about these kinds of struggles. The book is set in a time when the opioid crisis, the book was set in a time when the opioid crisis was certainly an issue that was talked about more openly than it had in the past. But I think it was still then and is still now very taboo, and very much there's a sense of personal accountability that I think is starting to change, which is good. But at the time that the book is set, it's and with Gertie sort of struggles with this too. There's a sense that, well, if you would just try harder to stop using, you'd be okay. And so that creates an atmosphere where it feels unsafe to talk about it with people who you don't know, you don't know how they might feel about it. But Gertie and Cindy know they have each other, and they know they have that safe space. But at the same time, it's a very intense space where there's not a lot of room to breathe. There's not a lot of room to be teenagers. And they do find ways, certainly, but there's a little bit of a shadow. And I think growing up the child of addicts, there's a real sense of secrecy. The parent might be using without or not openly, maybe, they might be trying to hide it as Gertie's dad does. And when you grow up with that sense of secrecy, it can seep into even your most fortified relationships, such as Cindy's and Gertie's. And we certainly see Gertie struggle with that when she just cannot bring herself to tell Cindy the secret she's keeping.
Yeah.
And yeah, so and so we see Cindy and Gertie having to work through that in a way that would perhaps be much less charged and difficult in a relationship between two teenagers who hadn't been bonded by trauma in the way that Cindy and Gertie have.
Yeah. Speaking of charged relationships, I was hoping that you would read a short section from the book, both so we can hear Gertie's voice, but also to get a little sense of, one of the other kind of major cultural, structures that Gertie is having to struggle with and against, as she has all these other challenges as a teen daughter of an addict and someone with a secret that threatens to, crack her world apart.
Absolutely. So this is 196, right? That starts
that's right.
midway through the summer. Okay, great.
And if you want to give any context, this is a little further than halfway through the book, so please feel free to.
So this is a section about halfway through the book, and it is in the future timeline, but looking back on the years following the summer Gertie spends in Sioux Falls. Midway through the summer, the study abroad office lost its administrative assistant, and I took her place and went full-time, which allowed me to quit my other job ringing up burgers at Wendy's. I opened the office at 8 each morning to take calls from parents who wanted to complain about their children's troubles abroad. At 5 every evening, I left to go to the bar, where I stayed until I couldn't any longer, and I'd go home and sleep for a few hours until Curon crept into the room in the middle of the night, and I opened my arms to him and took him inside me. He always asked what I wanted, and I always wanted it. The shame was lifting slowly, vines burned back in a garden. I'd been seen as a slut before, and not even a deserving one. She's not hot enough to cause so much drama, Austin said once. And I'd also been seen as frigid, only halfway present and withholding. But I'd never been appreciated for what could be given to me. It wasn't just boys my age. Vaughn had looked at me and seen my body. Early on, when he hadn't been around long, and my goodwill toward him was starting to shrivel, he put a snide smile on his face and said to my mom, "Does Gertie have a boyfriend?" "I don't think so," she said. "Maybe she needs sex," Vaughn said, his eyes on me. "It would loosen her up a little." I was putting my shoes on, getting ready to flee. What Vaughn said lashed my wrist to the wall where I'd been holding on for balance. His voice was slim, snake-like. He knew how he was making me feel, and he was doing it on purpose. My body was without provenance, he seemed to say. I was nothing on my own. I told Curon this story one night that years ago summer. He'd sat up abruptly in bed, the sheet falling from his chest as he twisted to look at me. "You're not serious," he said. I hesitated. Talking about sex was as risky as doing it. opening myself up to judgment that had depleted me and would continue to until one day there would be nothing left. But I was starting to feel, even in those early days, that Kieran and I could imagine something different. It made me think sex was something other people would always use to change me. It was always about them, not me. God, I'm sorry, you deserve better. I reached up, let the back of my hand fall against his arm. I think I found better, if it's okay to say that. Kieran placed a hand on either side of me and kissed me between my eyes. I keep saying crazy things to you, he whispered, but I want to marry you one day. Kieran fell asleep soon after, but I couldn't. I turned on the bedside lamp. He'd scared me. The days were numbered until he had to go back to Dublin. The hours were numbered until I had to be at work. But my pulse was shredding sleep apart, leaving it in a pile on the bedroom floor. I'd been reading a book of stories by Pam Houston, who wrote about life in a way that made me see how much I'd been missing. The spine of the old paperback groaned as I folded the book over on itself. I'd read Waltzing the Cat before, but this time I was searching for something. I shifted the book within the perimeter of the lamplight and started from the beginning. And when I reached the end of the first story, I found what I was looking for. I felt like this was it, like I was taking a step into my future too.
Thank you so much. That was so nice to hear that. As I was reading Atomic Hearts, I kept thinking that telling the story of a teen girl in America is inseparable from telling the story of misogyny as the functional, normative experience of being a woman. Gertie is an extraordinarily thoughtful character, and still she is buffeted by women hating that appears sometimes veiled and sometimes blazing and truly awful, as when a private photo taken by a boyfriend is shared on a text chain, or when an ex tells her that he loved her even though she was a slut. How does cultural misogyny warp Gertie's experience and steer her life in ways seen and invisible?
Yeah. So when Gertie's a teenager, as is true with many teenage girls, she starts to experience life differently in terms of how her body is viewed by others, not just her age, but by adult men as well. And in the section I just read, Vaughn is her mother's boyfriend who is making a sexually explicit comment about her. And as many girls do, there is a sense earlier on of Gertie putting her head down and powering through and ignoring it. I think there's often a fear that if a girl acknowledges the misogyny being directed at her in the moment, it will get worse. And ignoring it is a way to make it go away in the immediate sooner. And I think Gertie does that. I mean, she certainly, it seeps into her, and I think it works its slow annual damage as it does on most girls. But as the book goes on, as the summer goes on, when she's a teenager, it becomes so focused and so intense, and it culminates in such a traumatic experience that it almost sharpens so much inside of her that it reaches a breaking point. And the breaking point that I'm thinking of is when she smashes the phone of one of the boys who's been sharing the photo. And that in and of itself is a small thing, right? Not much lasting damage done, but there is so little recourse a teenage girl has for this type of misogyny, especially in earlier days. The book is set, the teenage timeline is pre-Me Too. So I think there's less of a sense that speaking out is okay and that you'll be believed. And, certainly now is where you're entering Trump 2.0. We all, we think of, I think the days of Me Too are over, so it was a period that has come and gone. And I am fearful for young women coming up now, as I was for Gertie, as I was writing her. But it's certainly that experience, in a way she can't solve the misogyny in the world around her. But after that summer, she does say, I'm never going to let this happen to me again. I'm never going to let something like this happen to me again. Even if it takes a while for that to fully unravel in her, even if it takes a while for that idea to take root in her and really become something that she uses to change her life. She does she does get a little bit fortified by that summer. And when she finds someone who she trusts, when she finds a man who she can see would never do something like that to her, she makes a somewhat risky decision to end the sort of long-term relationship she's had in college and try to be with someone who lives thousands of miles away. And it's a risk, but it's one she makes not on a whim. It's a decision she makes not on a whim, but out of a deep sense that this person is a place of safety.
Mm-hmm. So we, in previous questions, skirted around the intertext of Atomic Hearts, what begins as a fantasy novel that Gertie is writing, and that transforms into something like, I'll use your term, auto fiction of her experiences that we read in this sort of meta layered way as readers of Atomic Hearts. And when she's writing the fantasy novel, she thinks of it as a genre of girls with gifts who can get out of impossible situations, whether that's magic or some other kind of ability. But as that fantasy novel evolves through her experiences, she turns away from that genre and the idea of a girl with gifts. And I wonder if you talk a little bit about the shift in genre of the intertext that happens and how it becomes instead a kind of a raw and immediate and visceral genre for addressing her experiences.
Absolutely. I I do think in some ways the book is about Gertie's genealogy as a writer. And
Mhm.
I'll just say anecdotally, the fantasy novel she's writing as a teenager is one I tried to write when I was 14 or 15. And I think down to the characters' names, I kept them the same. And
Amazing.
that fantasy novel for
I
its
liked Hayden as the boy's name. I
oh, of
thought.
course, yeah, it feels very like of that very much a fantasy character's name would be Hayden.
Hmm.
And that book existed on a floppy disk for some number of years, and now it's lost to the ether, but
Oh no.
yeah, well, I think it's okay. Probably for the best. But Gertie very much as a teenager is interested in how she can use writing to escape her life. And she does that by trying to imagine something that is so completely different from her own world. A fantasy novel where there's a war against an evil lord, where there's, a rebellion that she finds herself a part of, where she finds herself drawn to a cause she really knows nothing about, but that's not, untrue. Or I think for a teenager trying to write a fantasy novel, there's not too much of a concern about knowing the politics of the world you found yourself in. But as Gertie writes, as she continues to write that fantasy novel, I think she comes to find that even though she's tried to set it in such a wildly different place, it still is mirroring her own life. And she finds the struggles of Jamie, the female protagonist in the fantasy novel, perhaps materially to be very different from hers, but emotionally to be quite similar. And I think that is the very start of Gertie as a writer changing her focus from fantasy to writing something that tracks closer to her life. At the same time, I think she never gives up on the idea that every kind of writing is a little bit of a fantasy. And as we see in college, she has really shifted the pendulum to writing what might be somewhat imaginationless stories that aren't very good, but she keeps at it. And as she gets older, I think she learns and is learning in the adult timeline of the book to allow fantasy into realism in some ways. And that is a central part, I think, of the frame of the book is how can imagination be a tool of forgiveness? How can storytelling reshape our lives, not just to make them bearable, but to to find meaning in a way that it's almost like a bit of a tectonic shift where the landscape is still the same, but something shifted and you can see inside it in a way you couldn't before. And so Gertie's learning as an adult to she's learning as an adult to reconcile her original love of fantasy with her instincts now as a writer to write autofiction, but in a way that she isn't bound to, where it's not, where she can allow it to track away from her life in a way that she had a hard time accepting earlier in her writing career.
Hmm. So I try and typically steer clear of biographical scouting in a work of fiction, but because you cite your father's blog, Storytime, as a source for Gertie's father's story, I wanted to ask you about why that ended up being a piece of the archive and how you ended up integrating it into some of your own writing, and I believe it was some of your father's last writing while he was alive. Is that true?
It is true, yes. And I, my father was an incredible writer. He wrote, his career was in advertising, but I always sort of thought that if he had wanted to, he could probably have written a novel. But the character of the father is, even if the events are fiction, the character of the father is very much inspired by my own father, who was incredibly witty, very smart, a big reader, struggled with addiction. And I, so I knew that his, I knew that I wanted the voice of the character in the book to have a similar feel to my father's voice. I wanted it to have the really intense warmth as well as the distance and sometimes, the distance and the almost coldness that can come from struggling with depression and addiction. And so it was important to me that more than any other character, in fact, she's probably the only character apart from, actually, no, that's not true. I shouldn't say that. He's more than any other character, he tracks most closely to the real person who was my father. And as I was writing it, I remembered the blog he had kept in the months before he died and just how funny it was. And so I thought, rather than, I mean, I experienced those stories as a young woman reading his blog, but I wondered how much better it would have been even to have experienced those stories as, teenager hearing him tell them. And so I wanted to work that voice in a little bit, and I wanted to work, his humor in a real way. And I thought there was no better way to do it than to incorporate a couple of his blog posts into dialogue, into a letter that Gertie receives in the teenage timeline of the book. It came without me really even thinking about it. There was a time after I incorporated that into the book where I wondered if I needed to take it out, if there was issues of citation, if there were issues of maybe having it track a little too close to home, but
Yeah.
it felt so true to me that I had a conversation with my editor and he loved it and so did I, so we kept it in.
I can imagine that being fraught and both feeling like it brought kind of a specialness to your father's words living on in your own, but also kind of wondering, what he would think of it and trying to imagine, the life of one's words after you're gone. I think there's all kinds of challenges there.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I did after he died was we had his Facebook deleted. back then, I'm not sure what it's like today, but back then, if a family member died, you could write an email and send the death certificate, and they would delete the Facebook account. And I'm not even really on Facebook anymore, but somehow I maybe wish I had kept that. And then there were also, some journals of his that we found when we were cleaning out his apartment that we ended up not keeping because they were rehab journals, and I felt it wasn't my place to read them. And now, of course, I wish I had kept them.
Yeah.
But it was, of course, in the days after a tragedy like that, you're working sort of on a different frequency. So, but yeah, but I think ultimately, I think he would be happy to see those words come into this novel. And, his brother, my uncle, will certainly recognize those stories too. So when he reads the book, I'm sure we'll be talking about it. So, but it was important to me, and I'm glad I kept it in. And also, it's the only character in the book whose name is the name of a real person. Mark was my father's name. So
Oh, okay.
I leaned into autofiction very in the most closely and in with his character.
Hmm. So this is a novel layered with different kinds of striving for forgiveness. Forgiveness and its triumphs and failures take many forms, but certainly the idea of coming to understand oneself as separate from, but necessary to our relationships, whether that's with parents or friends, is part of this process of seeking forgiveness and also kind of understanding what it means to forgive yourself. And Gertie has both of those things to deal with, a secret that is heavy and that she feels deeply that she must seek forgiveness for, but also the need to forgive herself for certain choices that she couldn't understand at the moment as having context that would allow her to forgive herself. So I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about forgiveness in the novel and its many forms.
Oh, absolutely. Forgiveness, I so I think Gertie probably struggles the most with forgiving herself. And I love what you said about how we exist, together and separate from the relationships that we form. And I think Gertie as a teenager might struggle so much with forgiving herself because she has an impulse to kind of map herself out in a way she hopes people will see her, or she maps herself in a way that she thinks people do see her. She struggles with acting like the person she thinks people want her to be. And I think when you let that influence on your identity seep in, when something happens that you need to forgive yourself for, you're left wondering what part of me did the bad thing. Who am I that I did this? And when you can't answer that question of who am I, which, honestly, who can completely, but when you really can't answer that question, it it becomes a real hindrance to forgiveness
Mhm.
because you can't see the parts of yourself that deserve forgiveness. And there are parts of everybody that deserve forgiveness. So while I think Gertie is, almost in some ways so eager during the summer, she's so eager to forgive her father for the things he's doing as he does them that she doesn't tell her mother what's going on. She doesn't tell another adult. It's almost like preemptive forgiveness until sort of the big explosive thing at the end of the summer that she then will struggle with later in finding ways to forgive her father. And to go back to writing and the purpose of writing and imagination and storytelling, it's really through that Gertie learns to forgive others and to forgive herself because she realizes that she wants to write stories where people are redeemed. And
Mm.
something that uh, there was a blurb for my book by Sadiq Fafana blurbed my book in a way that I found was so generous. And he said, the book teaches you that you don't have to be a saint to reach redemption.
Mm.
And that really
I
stuck
love
with
that.
me.
Yeah.
I know, me too. I thought that was such a lovely and generous and beautiful way to
I
think about.
really hope it's true as well for
Yes, me too.
selfishly.
Oh, oh God, me too. So, so yeah, I think that's what Gertie learns with herself and also with her father, that you can forgive for horrible things that you've done or that others have done. And that's a big part of why, even with sort of all the bad men in the book or the bad boys in her teenage years, I at least tried to give them all some kind of complexity. And that's not to excuse the things they do, but I hope it is just I hope it gives some sort of dimension to these people as very flawed, or as people as flawed individuals who make mistakes. And there is a very wide scale, of mistakes that can be made by humans. And, we see some fall into different ranges in this book, but through writing and through the relationships of Gertie's that survive, she learns that, I hope that I can say that she sort of learns, there's no point to life without forgiveness.
Hmm. Hmm. Wow. Well, I feel like that is so true and something that comes across so strongly in the novel, and Gertie's willingness to forgive even in the moment sometimes when things are being done to her, I think is extraordinary. Before I let you go, Megan, I was wondering if you would share some things that you've been reading and loving recently. I know my listeners are always really hungry for recommendations by writers that they like.
Oh, absolutely. So I have recently discovered, and I know I'm very late to the party here, but I've recently discovered Miriam Taves, and she is just fabulous. You know,
Tell me a title by
um,
her.
oh, sorry. So I recently read All My Puny Sorrows.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I didn't know that was how her name was pronounced.
I Googled it and that's what I found, but I could be wrong. So, because I know I was like toes, yeah. So
Yeah, I was going with toes, but for no good reason.
me
I
neither.
just sort of
Yeah.
throwing it out there. But I'm glad you actually did the work to.
Yeah. So yeah, but my editor wrote me and was like, "Have you read All My Puny Sorrows?" And I was like, "Oh, no, I haven't, but I'll put it on my to read list." And he was like, "Wow, I just like would have assumed Miriam Taves was such a huge influence on you. I feel like, I see a lot of parallels." So I've started to read her work since then, and All My Puny Sorrows is just hilarious and heartbreaking. I'm of
It's a
course
great
Yeah,
book.
it's
It's
so
so good.
good. I'm of course drawn to it because it's, the protagonist is a writer and it's very much about families and imperfect people,
Mhm.
finding love and loving their families. So I would highly recommend that. I find myself very regularly revisiting the poetry of Laura Kaczynski. She provides the epigraph to a book to my book, to Atomic Hearts, and it's from a poem in one of her collections, it's from a poem in one of her books, The Infinitesimals. And
Not an easy title
no,
to
no.
to throw around.
And lastly, I'll say I just, as a debut novelist this year, and there are so many wonderful novels coming out, I really loved Den Michelle Norris's When the Harvest Comes. Beautiful story about how relationships change, and also very much a story about a child's relationship with their parents, and in particular for this book with their father. And
Is this
that
one out already?
it is. It came out in April, so it's pretty new, but highly recommend. And then if you'll allow me one more
Of
that is
course, yeah.
coming out in August, actually the week after my book, Nick Fuller Guggens' second novel, The Frequency of Living Things. I loved his first book, which why am I suddenly blanking on the title? Of course, I loved his first book, The Great Transition, and Nick is also a friend of mine. We went to grad school together, and I'm just so tickled that we have novels coming out within a week of each other. And
Oh, that's so nice.
yeah, it feels like looking back to, more than 10 years ago in grad school together, and now, seeing our books out in the world is really, really special. So
That is very special, and I will definitely be checking out his work as well as the other things that you're recommending. But I want to really encourage my listeners to go out and get Atomic Hearts by Megan Cummins. I found this book to just be such a unforgettable combination of a really distinct voice that I wanted to live in my head, but also just taking up things about teenagerdom that I felt like spoke to me and to my friends' experiences in all these different ways that allowed me to reflect on them and come to perhaps some new understanding and maybe even some forgivenesses of my own. So thank you so much for the novel, and thank you so much for coming on to talk about it, Megan.
thank you so much, Chris. I had a fabulous time.
Well, that's all for me for now. My thanks to Megan Cummins for coming on to talk about her debut novel, Atomic Hearts. You can find links to purchase Atomic Hearts and all of Megan's recommended books at the website, burnedbybooks.com. There you'll find all of our previous episodes, links to buy a podcast t-shirt, and ways to get in contact. As you listen, take a moment to rate the show on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts. Until next time, this has been Burned by Books.